Hey everybody, this is Dream, and this is going to be college basketball for tomorrow. This actually starts at 2 p.m., so be aware of that. So this is Sunday's games. We have 4 games. All of them look a little bit lopsided when it comes to plus minus. So Tennessee, Oklahoma State, Notre Dame, and Arizona State are all favored pretty heavily in these games. There are some decent players from the other teams that we'll take a look at. So without further ado, can you guys smash that like button and that subscribe button on this channel? I really do appreciate it. With that said, let's get into the players themselves. So we're going to start with guards, and we're going to look at DJ Horn here for Arizona State. Now he's had 23 and 43 points in his first 2 games this season. You're actually seeing last year's stats on DraftKings still, but he had a pretty big game in his second game. His fantasy points per minute are about 1.1 so far this season, and he's got a high usage rate at 21 per game. His team is favored to win their game by a pretty good amount, and he's one of the best players on their team. Then we're going to look at Devin Cambridge for Arizona State. He is $5,600. He had 24 and 31 in his first 2 games. He's got a fantasy point per minute of 109. 1.09, and then he's got a pretty good high usage rate for them as well at 21. Overall, really solid play for Arizona State. And his price point is actually pretty nice here. Surprisingly low. Then we're going to look at Frankie Collins for Arizona State. He's a third guard. He's had 38 and 23 fantasy points in the first 2 games. His fantasy point per minute is a little bit low at 93.93, but he's still a pretty good player, and he's had the highest usage rate as the starting point guard. I expect him to play well again in this plus matchup for those guys. Then we're going to get KJ Simpson here for Colorado. Now, they aren't favored to beat Tennessee, obviously, but he's a good player. He's had 25 and 30 fantasy points in the 2 games. He had some good games last season, too, against pretty decent teams, including Arizona, Utah, and some others, UCLA. So I expect him to play well despite the difficult team. He's also averaging 1.08 fantasy points per minute so far this season, and his usage rate is ridiculous at 31. His price point makes him viable on the slate, even though he's going against a tough defensive team, but I do like him here. Trey Wertz here for Notre Dame. He's also pretty inexpensive here. He had 32.8 in the first game they had. His usage rate was 90.91, and his fantasy points per minute was 0.91, and his usage was 17 in that game. Pretty good value play on the slate. Then we're going to look at Jalen Moore here for Oklahoma. So he's in a pretty good spot here for Oakland. And Oakland isn't favored to win this game against Oklahoma State, but he's one of the best players on the team. He had 36 fantasy points in the first game of the season, and almost a 98.98 fantasy points per minute with a 26 usage rate. He looks like a really solid player, and I think he should be able to do his stuff in this game despite the lopsidedness of the game itself. Then we're going to look at, let's see here. Sorry, lost my place. Wertz for Notre Dame. Oh, I already looked at. Sorry, Avery. I lost my spot. Avery Anderson here for Oklahoma State at $8,300. He has had 23 and 31 in the first 2 games. Not as good as some of the other players, and he's a little bit more expensive. And he's also at 0.98 fantasy points per minute, but his usage rate is still high at 25. And so I do think he's got a lot of upside. He had some really mammoth games last season as the season progressed, so I think he's got good upside despite the high price. And obviously, he's going up against an easy opponent, so that helps. Then we're going to look at Bryce Thompson here for Oklahoma State as well. His price point's a little bit cheaper, and he's actually better than Avery. He's had 30 and 27 fantasy points the first 2 games. His fantasy point per minute is at 0.9, and his usage is at 27. So I like both those guys. Pretty good, but they're probably secondary options compared to some of the other guys on the slate. I got 2 more guards here. I only have a couple forwards. There's not a whole lot of good forwards on this one. Santiago Vescasi for Tennessee. Price is high, but he's a really good player. In the first game, he had 32 fantasy points, 1.05 fantasy points per minute, and a 17 usage rate. His price point is a little bit high for what I would like for him, but Tennessee has a really nice opponent in Colorado that he's going to be able to take advantage of. And then finally, see here, Dwayne Cohill for Youngstown State. Against Notre Dame, that's going to be a tough matchup, but he's the best player on their team. He has 28 and 34 in the first 2 games with a 1.04 fantasy point per minute and a whopping 23 usage rate. He was really good last season too, though he didn't play a whole lot of good teams. But I expect him to play well in this one despite the tough opponent and hopefully get it in the 25-point range. And if he can do that, then he'll pay off for us here. Then we're looking at forwards. We're going to look at, oops, let me click this over here. We're going to look at Keaton Harvey for Oakland. He's one of the few guys on Oakland I do like here. I actually have 2 guys here. His price points is way too cheap. In his first 2 games, he had 34 and 30 fantasy points, averaging a whopping 1.17 fantasy point per minute, and he had a 20 usage rate. Yeah, it's a tough matchup for them, but he's a player that's playing a lot of minutes, and I expect him to do well in this matchup with that minimum price. Then Trey Townsend for Oakland as well. Now, he had 32 and 28 in his first 2 games, and he had a fantasy point per minute at 1.1 with a 23 usage rate. So I expect him to have a pretty good game here. He's a little expensive, honestly, but I think he's just because of the matchup being the underdog, but he is a good player, and he has some opportunity here. Nate Lazarewski for Notre Dame. He's one of the more expensive guys. He had 48.5 fantasy points in the game 1, and he had a whopping 1.28 fantasy point per minute, which is best on the slate. And he also had a 27 usage rate, which is in the top 10. So I really like him on the slate. Obviously, he's pretty expensive, but there's not too many forwards available, and he's the best expensive guy, just best flat-out player at forward overall. Then we're going to look at Oliver Nukahu. I don't know how to say your name, I'm sorry. Anyway, for Tennessee, his price point is $5,500. Now, he only had 18 fantasy points in his last game, but he has some potential here. He should play a decent amount of minutes. The only real issue with him is the fantasy point per minute, currently sitting at 0.78. But it was really hard to find a lot of good forwards, and he's a pretty cheap guy. Somebody you could definitely roster and hope that he has that kind of a blow-up game and a very plus matchup. Then we're going to look at Malik Green for Youngstown State. Obviously, they got a tough opponent against Notre Dame, but he's had 39 and 26 in his first 2 games. He's only $5,000, and he has a whopping 1.5 fantasy point per minute. He only plays about 23 minutes a game, so you do have to be aware of that. But he does have a usage rate of 29 when he's in the game, and so he's definitely going to have an opportunity in this game to have a big one. It will be a tough game for him, but I think he has the capability of having a really solid game here. Even last season, when his minutes were pretty good, he was pretty consistent at getting in the 20 range, and at this price point, we can definitely pay off with that. And then last but not least, Musa Sis, I don't know how to say your name, I'm sorry, for Oklahoma State. He has had 34 and 24 in the first 2 games, had a 1.14 fantasy point per minute, and almost a 20 usage rate. Overall, really solid player. Obviously, his price is pretty high. I do like Nate Lazarewski better, but I think both players at that price point are pretty good. As you know, on DraftKings, we have 3 guards, 3 forwards, and 2 utilities. I definitely recommend using guards in the utility spots. There's so much more available there, and even the cheaper options are a little bit better than the cheaper options on the forwards, with the exception of Keaton Harvey. So, with that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below, and have a nice day, guys.